fishing, it's in my soul.
Welcome to the Salt Strong Podcast, disrupting fishing entertainment as you know it. Prepare to laugh. Prepare to get to know fishing legends in a whole new and unfiltered way. And on occasion, you might even learn a thing or two about fishing. Here's your host, Joe Simons. Like diamonds.
Hello, Salt Strong Nation. Joe Simons, like diamonds. We are back talking lures today with my friend Greg from Down Under. Now, here's the quick backstory. We've done a lot of podcasts. I think this might be 270 in terms of episodes, a lot of episodes. And we've talked, because we're more artificial guys over live bait. And I made the mistake of interchanging the words lure and bait for an artificial lure. And I got called out. This guy named John sends me this lengthy email, and he was doing it in a very nice way. And at the end, he's like, if you really want to talk lures, you got to get this guy, Greg, from Doc Lures in Australia, and your podcast. He's got the top podcast in Australia for talking lures. And I checked him out, and I was like, this is good stuff. And then we ended up having an offline chat just in general about what's working, right, in terms of catching fish and what's working out there in terms of creating content. And we're like, man, it'd be really fun to do a podcast talking about lures that work pretty much anywhere, regardless if you're fishing in Florida or in Texas, North Carolina over here, or Gold Coast there in Australia. So first and foremost, welcome to the show, Greg.
Well, thank you, Joe, for an amazing introduction. Yes, we do have to give a big shout out to John, to Extreme Armchair Angler, who he's one of my, you might call him a raving fan. Others might call him a stalker. I'm not sure, but he's certainly, he's got you in his crosshairs now. He's had me in his crosshairs for some time. So thank you, John, for putting the two of us together. It's awesome to be here. Thank you for inviting me along for a chat.
So what's your story? I know the Doc Lures, and you have a really popular podcast. What's the whole backstory? How'd you get into that?
Yeah, well, I don't know how long we've got, Joe. It's a very long story, but let me narrow it down. So Doc Lures comes about because I am in fact a doctor. I have a PhD in aquatic ecology, and I've spent 30 odd years as a consulting scientist doing all kinds of stuff on waterways. Not so much fisheries, but on waterway health and looking after fish habitat and that kind of stuff. But since I was about 15 years old, I've also been a custom lure maker. And so I had for quite a long time some lure making courses and ebooks and that sort of thing online. And a few people started saying, oh, you're the only doctor of fishing I know. Well, actually, I studied with a whole bunch of people who are doctors of fishing. I tell you, 30 odd guys that I went through uni with were all mad keen fishers. But anyway, the name Doc Lures came about, and it's kind of stuck. And a couple of years ago, when I started the lure fishing podcast, the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast, I decided I'd use that handle. And so it's now firmly cemented, and I don't think I'll be able to shake it for the rest of my life. But that's pretty cool. I like that.
I'm curious, when you were doing your little ebooks and instructions on making homemade lures, what was the top one? What was the one that got the most attention?
Yeah, well, I was doing handmade timber lures, and look, there were a few. I had quite a few US customers that were doing my classes and reading my ebooks. One of the most popular ones, I don't know if it was the top one, but one of the most popular ones was a deep-bodied, hard-bodied lure that I developed that was completely silent. So the hooks on this lure clipped up underneath the body of the lure. There were no rings. There were no rattles. It was weighted. It dived down to about 21, 22 feet. And was absolutely silent and fantastic when you're fishing in a tournament and you've been hammering the fish for days and everybody's using loud rattling lures and you want to switch over to something when they're getting a bit gun shy towards the end of a tournament. So that was a very popular one.
And so how did you get into that in the first place? I'm going to call you a more of a super smart marine biologist type of person. They don't seem to be the guys, actually creating lures.
Yeah, look, don't get too carried away with the super smart thing. It's that's a bit of a misnomer. I sometimes think that the smart people are the ones that actually drop out of doing a PhD and get on with living life. But I started out making lures at around about the age of 15 years. And I started making them because, and without wanting to give my age away too much, mate, this is in the days before internet and that kind of thing. I'd go into the local tackle shop, and as a secondary school student, I didn't have a lot of money, but I'd look at all the lovely Rapalas and Nils Master lures on the wall, and I'd long to have those and give them a bit of a try, but didn't have the coin to be able to do it. And so I started on my way home from school, putting my push bike on the side of the road and sneaking into these construction sites and picking up little offcuts of timber, and then started trying to carve them and turn them into lures and trying to mimic those Rapalas that I'd seen in the store, which is kind of cool. And I guess one of the things that worked in my favor, and it was just pure fluke, but I very early on in that process made a lure that it was butt ugly. I've got to tell you, I wish I had a photo of it actually to show you. It was butt ugly. It should never have caught a fish, but I took it down to the local lake, which was stocked at that time with brown and rainbow trout. And I just happened to find one very suicidal rainbow trout that nailed this lure, and it was one of the very first ones I made. And from that point on, I was hooked. And I think it took quite a long while before I caught another fish on a homemade lure, but it didn't matter. I knew it was possible, and so I've continued. I still continue today. I don't have a lot of time these days to get into the workshop, but I still make my own lures. And over the Christmas break, I've got some plans to put together a nice hard-bodied vibration bait that I'm going to make weedless and try and sling under some of the mangroves here in North Queensland where I live.
Too cool, man. That's awesome. Yeah. So you had a suicidal trout. I love that term.
It was about 6 pounds too. It was a good fish for a first one on a homemade lure.
So before we get into these top 5 lures, I want to hear about the podcast as well. How long have you been doing that?
Yeah, so I started the podcast in January 2019. I'm a couple of episodes ahead of you. I do 3 episodes a week, but it's an audio-only podcast. So we've just published our 300th episode.
Wow.
We've got quite a good following now. And what I do is I interview one of Australia's top anglers each time, and we pick a single species and a single location in each episode. And we talk about how to find the fish at that particular location, what the bite windows are in terms of tides and winds and the weather conditions and all that kind of stuff. And then I put them in the hot seat, much as you've done with me today. And I say, okay, if you could only use 3 lures for the next 3 months for this particular species, what would they be? And all of my guests try and get 6 or 7 or 8 lures squeezed in there, and I've got to rein them in. But it's a lot of fun, and I've had a long list of Australian guests. And my friend, I think it's about time I had a US guest, so I'm going to throw the invitation out there right here and now to put the boot on the other foot and have you come and join me on the Australian Lure.
Yeah, but you guys heard it. This is recording, so yep, the invitation cannot be revoked.
Done now. It's locked in.
Yes. All right, that would be awesome. You've had no U.S. guests yet, huh? It's all
no US guests as yet. No. But it is the Australian lure fishing podcast, of course. So you'd expect it would be mostly Australian.
This could be the downfall of your entire podcast. You're going to end up losing all your subscribers
I sincerely doubt that, Joe. I think we have a lot of species that are quite similar, and a lot of fishing environments and fishing techniques that cross over nicely. So I think we could have a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, I told you that first time we talked. I mean, we've got quite a few insiders. These are people paying to be part of our online fishing club, which is clearly America. I mean, it's really for inshore saltwater fishing from Texas to kind of New Jersey area. But we kept hearing the same thing, like this stuff works over here. We have mangroves, we have flats, we got barramundi. I mean, which is kind of looks like the snook, and fights like one, right? And it's like
very similar.
Yeah.
Yep.
Crazy. So
yeah. So perhaps we need to take it another step, mate, and I need to bring you over here, and we'll have a fish off, and then I can go over there and have a fish off, and we'll see who wins that competition.
I'll put my brother in place for me, and I'll have a cold beer, and I'll be cheering him on.
Sounds good.
Fairly confident he could. You could beat me. I think Luke might be able to beat you. He's got this special gift. And you wait till you see the podcast we just did. Man, it humiliated me on camera, on a live camera on the water. We went out in the water. That takes guts when you do a live podcast on the water, no cuts. Oh man, it was tough.
Yeah. I haven't done it yet, but yeah, I can imagine. I do quite a bit of live streaming, and yeah,
he ruined me because
it's wrong. It's going to go wrong.
Yeah, when it's hard to really focus on the right retrieval and the tempo when you're trying to talk and think of what you're going to say next. It really struggled. But anyhow, that was my excuse. So let's get into the 5 lures that can catch fish anywhere. And we did not premeditate. I have no idea what you're going to say, so I'm curious.
No.
What are lures
and coincidentally, I have no idea what I'm going to say either, Joe.
Okay,
so what comes out now is straight off the cuff. So backstory for those that are watching this at home. There's a little bit of a time difference in the US and Australia. So Joe flicked me an email saying, here's what I'd like to talk about, the 5 best lures that will catch fish anywhere. And I got up this morning and made a coffee and sort of walked around having a quiet, easy morning and sat down in front of the computer 15 minutes before we started and found that the topic had been changed and I had no preparation done. So this is straight off the cuff, and I appreciate it's going to be a lot of fun. So, Joe, what I thought, so 5 lures that catch fish anywhere. Now, here in Australia, we're blessed, much like you are in Florida, we're blessed with lots and lots of different species. And I know you guys at Salt Strong, you've narrowed it down to your 4 favourites that you really like to home in on. I could do the same thing here, but what I thought I'd do is be a little bit broader than that. So I'll talk briefly about the basic lure classes that I would take with me. So if I was thinking about going on the road for the next 6 months, for example, in Australia, these are the 5 that I'd have to have in my tackle box. And I reckon if I was coming over to have a fish with you in that fish off in Florida, they'd be the same lures in the box when I came over there as well. So how does that sound?
I love it. I think it's great. Yeah, it's I'm excited to see what you say.
Terrific. All right. You want me to start? Shall I kick off with lure number 1?
Yeah, in no particular order. You tell me.
Well, I'll give you a little bit of an explanation for each of them because it's difficult to put them into a particular order. In a lot of ways, for me, a topwater lure would have to be first because I just love this topwater strike and the topwater action, a lot of anglers do. But that wouldn't necessarily be the first lure I'd choose if catching a fish was a high priority. So the topwater is not always successful. So my number 1 would be a soft plastic paddle tail. Okay. And typically in Australia, that would be anywhere from about 4 to 7 inches in length, depending on where we're fishing and what species we're fishing for. And the reason I love the soft plastic paddle tails is just their versatility. You can do so much of them. You can rig them weedless and forward weight them so you can skip them under mangroves, which is something I love to do. You can sink them down and you can work them through weed beds and over structure. And, that big flat tail gets a lovely vibration. I'm very much into sound and vibration when it comes to lures. I think that's a really important and often overlooked aspect of lure fishing. People get very fixated on color, but sometimes the sound and the vibration of a lure can be so much more effective and so much more important. So I love those big paddle tails for that reason. But you can drop them down, a steep bank and get them down deep and then slow roll them out, or you can hop them across the bottom like a prawn, or lots of different ways you can fish them, burn them across the surface or burn them around the docks, which is something we love to do here for mangrove jack, which I think you guys might refer to as mangrove snapper in the US. So very, very versatile lure. That would be my first one. And I've just jotted down a couple of notes here, mate. So the Z-Man Diesel Minnow, do you guys get those over in the States?
Oh, yeah. We have our custom Slam Shady now comes in that mold, and the Diesel Minnow. I love that one.
I was going to mention that, and I'm looking forward to getting my hands on one of the custom Slam Shadies, mate, and slinging it around over here. So,
let me share some kind of somewhat exciting news for anyone who's at least made it this far. You'll be one of the first ones to know. We're working with Z-Man to because we own the Slam Shady. It's a registered trademark, and we're working with them to on like a licensing deal to get the Slam Shady eventually worldwide. So because I know they sell a lot in Australia, they sell a lot in Japan, and then obviously America. So that would be so cool. But Slam Shady in Australia.
That's really, really cool. And I know Gareth at TT Lures will be very excited about that as well. And I know that you're going to get another email or a phone call from Extreme Armchair Angler in the next 24 hours or so after this podcast.
He's probably already halfway done typing it, old John.
Yeah. John will be right on you. He's looking forward to those lures coming over. But Joe, we've got some homegrown Australian versions of these lures as well. So I'm just going to mention a couple of our local varieties. So a couple of other paddle tails that I'd look at, the Samaki Boom Baits Bomb Shad and the Pro Lure Fishtail. So they're both Australian made. Pro Lure are definitely selling overseas as well now. I know they're in quite a few different countries. I don't know if you can get them in the States, but go and have a look at their website. And Samaki, a local brand here in Australia, makes some great lures. So those two soft plastics would be high on the list as well. And again, nice fat-bodied, bulky-bodied paddle tails that you can skip, because in a lot of cases over here, that's a really important thing to be able to do to get into the structure where other people aren't getting and where the fish are sitting in tight.
What's the number one way to rig up these paddle tails, these little swim baits?
Oh, look, it varies tremendously. My favorite way is to rig them up on a Gamakatsu EWG wide gape hook, and I wrap a little bit of lead wire around the shank, or I've got a little mold and I put a bit of lead around the shank of the hook, and I'll rig them weedless that way quite often with a bait screw at the front. And that allows me to sling them right under heavy undercover and that kind of stuff, and get them into some tight structure and work them through some heavy snags. But if I was fishing, for example, for barramundi in impoundments, do the snook get into impoundments and storages over in the States there, or are they more an estuarine fish?
They'll get anywhere where the water is the right temperature.
Yeah. Well, over here in Australia, the barramundi, so our equivalent of your snook, gets stocked in some storages, and they get very large in those storages. So 36, 38 inches is a good fish. 40 inches is not unheard of. So they get pretty big. Yeah. But if I was using the soft plastic paddle tails in there, I'd rig them quite differently. I'd probably put a little bit more weight on the shank of the hook, and I'd put a stinger on there, and I'd use a larger soft plastic, and I'd slow roll that close to the bottom typically, depending on what the fish are doing, of course. And definitely with a treble hook stinger from the eye of the hook down to the, just embed that point in the middle of the tail on the back, just to give it a little bit of extra bite to pick up those short takes. So yeah, look, it does vary tremendously. They get used a lot here as well in brim competitions and that sort of thing. So these are much smaller lure, 2-3 inch paddle tails. And again, they rig them quite differently and fish them in different ways. And that's the beauty of that lure. It's just so versatile.
That's cool. Who's the biggest soft plastic brand in Australia?
Look, Z-Man would be up there, but look, there are quite a few. Yeah, Z-Man, Squidgies. I don't know if you get Squidgies in the US. Which is a Shimano brand these days. They're pretty big as well. Atomic, Berkeley's, they're all there. All the major international brands are here in Australia, and then we've got our homegrown varieties as well.
Cool. All right, my friend.
Give another popular one.
So number one, in no particular order, soft plastic paddle tail.
That's the one.
I can't argue with that, because that's my go-to kind of the search bait that I always start with. So
yeah. Look, so many different ways you can fish them. So many different species will take them. They're always a good choice. So number two on my list, Joe, has to be a topwater lure of some variety. Sure. Because as I said, I do like that topwater strike. I love the visual fishing. There are so many species here that we could target on the topwater. And so I had a very hard time. Once again, there's lots and lots of different varieties out there. But if I had to pick one, and in my podcast, I've interviewed now over 250 of Australia's top anglers. And there's one that keeps coming up over and over again, happens to be a favourite of mine as well, and that's the Bass Day Sugar Pen. And that lure is available in a variety of different sizes, but up here in the north, I like the 120 millimeter size. The beauty of that lure is being a dog walker style lure, it's tail weighted, so you can sling them a long way. They cast long, they cast accurate, and they can be fished in a few different ways. But they're a little more subtle, I guess, than a popper. And quite often I will go for a popper, but if I had to narrow down to one topwater lure, I think the stick baits are probably a little bit more versatile. The dog walker's a little bit more versatile. Probably take fish that are a little less active and aggressive than the poppers. The poppers would tend to spook some of those more timid species or the fish that are not actively feeding. So that would be my number two choice, mate.
Are you guys starting to see some of these manufacturers on the topwater lures in particular go to the single inline hooks, or is it still primarily treble hooks for conservation, hooking yourself, hooking dogs? And we're starting to see that now, which I think is a great thing in terms of just overall conservation. Yeah,
sorry to say we're not starting to see that yet. But it's something that I definitely do, and it's something that I talk about quite often in the podcast. And usually when I ask my guests, a lot of them will say, I switch over to an inline single. And it depends a little bit on the lure. And a few of my guests have mentioned this just recently, that some lures, when you switch over to a single, just will not swim properly, unfortunately. Yep. But look, I always recommend it whenever you can. I find I don't get a much lower conversion rate of strikes to hookups with a single hook than what I get with a treble. But as you say, much less damage to the fish. I like to just crush down the barb a little bit as well, so it's easy to unhook the fish. I'm largely catch and release. And that inline single, less prone to snagging, less damage to fish, less likely to get stuck in you when you get a fish in the boat. You're trying to get it back in the water quick, smart, and a lot going for it. So I definitely recommend it if you're up for it. And if you don't have an inline single, of course, the other thing you can do is add a second split ring to your lure, and excuse me, and just use a straight shanked regular hook, and that'll align the point appropriately. So there is a workaround for those that don't have an inline single in their box, but definitely jump onto the internet and order a few inline singles and give it a try. So
cool. And so what was the brand? You said Best Day, is that it?
Bass Day Sugar Pen would be one of my favorites. And then we've got a lot of local ones as well. I'm going to give a shout out to Halco Tackle over in Western Australia. And Halco produce a huge range of lures. I'm pretty sure they sell into the US as well. But the Halco Rooster Popper, if I had to go for a popper instead of a stick bait, the Rooster Popper would be my choice. And that's just in its various sizes, deadly on a whole range of different fish.
That's awesome. All right. So got soft plastic paddle tail, some type of top water. What do we got for number 3?
Well, lure number 3 for me would be some kind of shallow running, hard-bodied minnow, some sort of diving style lure. Okay. And in Northern Australia, particularly where I live, these are very, very popular on a whole range of species, but in particular the barramundi. And I love these lures because you can work them through structure, you can work them over flats. Because I've been narrowed down to 5 lures, I've chosen a floating, shallow swimming lure. But what I like to do with them also is bring along a few suspend dots or atomic trick bits, sticky weights, so that I can weight those lures down and convert a slow floating lure into a suspending lure as well. And I'll do that using heavier duty hooks and things as well to try and just reduce the buoyancy of the lure a little bit and allow it to hang a little bit longer. We find that quite often barramundi will tail a lure and not take it, but if you throw in a pause and that lure sits there and doesn't immediately float to the surface, quite often that will get a strike. So being able to do that's a good thing. These hard-bodied lures have such a strong beating action. The vibration they pump out is fantastic. So when you're fishing along those dirty water lines where you've got feeder creeks coming in, you might have some clean water in the river, dirty water coming in from a feeder creek, and you can run that lure through the dirty water and the fish will find it no problems whatsoever. And nail it. But, being able to run it across shallow flats as well, being able to run it across reed beds because it is a shallower running lure, very, very effective here in Australia.
What's the typical depth you're fishing for like barramundi there?
Well, look, it varies tremendously, but quite often it's 3 to 4 meters in our river systems. A lot of the time where we're fishing in the runoff, for example, so we have, in this part of Australia, we have 2 seasons. We don't have the 4 seasons that Southern Australia has. We have the wet season and the dry season. And when we're fishing towards the end of the wet season, where all the water's starting to run off of the flats and the rivers are in full flood, then quite often the barramundi will be up in a metre or less of water. And then at other times, they'll go down deeper into the rock bars and things in the estuaries. They might be in 7, 8 meters of water sometimes. So we do need a range of different diving depths in our lures. But typically, if I had to choose just one hard-bodied lure, I'd go for a shallower running one. I think they're just a little bit more versatile and a little bit easier to work. You can work a deep diver through shallow water, of course, by throwing in pauses as appropriate and keeping your rod tip up high and doing a few different things. But it's a little bit more tricky and perhaps not as effective as having a dedicated shallow running lure. So.
And so what are the brands for that?
Yeah, so the lures I've got there, the Bomber Long A is a classic Australian barramundi lure. A couple of local ones, the Classic Barra was 120 millimeter plastic lure. And we also have the Tilson Barra, which is a timber lure made here in Australia. They're both brilliant lures. And if you can get those over in the US, I would wager that they would be deadly on the snook as well.
Love it. And so spell it for me real quick, because we're going to have to put some links to all this stuff.
Tilson Barra, Tilsan, Tilsan.
Okay, got it.
Barra, yep. And the Classic Barra.
Sweet.
Which I think is available through JML Anglers Alliance.
Would you say in Australia, for the anglers doing kind of similar to us, kind of, the inshore, not going offshore, fishing the flats and stuff, are you seeing more of the hard baits, the hard style, or soft plastics? What's more popular?
Look, traditionally, it's been very much the hard baits. And I think there are parts of Australia where it's actually illegal to go fishing and not have a gold bomber in your tackle box. That's mandatory. It's one of those go-to lures that every Northern Australian angler has a number of. But look, there's been a lot of changes over the last few years, and whilst those timber lures are still very effective, I think lots of different techniques have been opened up by different styles of lures, and certainly the soft plastics are coming into their own. Another one that I'm going to talk about in just a moment is the soft prawn type lures, the soft shrimp. They've become very, very popular as well and very effective for a whole range of reasons. So the hard-body lures are definitely still very popular. And as I talk to anglers who are, tournament anglers and guides and the like who fish a lot for barramundi, they're still using those hard-body lures, but there's an increasing number of people using other styles of lures as well. And the next two will come into that category of up-and-coming lures for not just barramundi, but lots of species in Australia.
Cool. All right. What do we got next? This is you guys are still wondering or just tuning in for some reason. We've got soft plastic paddle tail. These are the 5 lures that can catch fish anywhere. Soft plastic paddle tail, some type of top water, some type of shallow running. What do you call it? A diving minnow? I know there's it's probably going to translate a little bit differently here. But some type of,
call them jerk baits.
Yeah. Some kind of shallow running. Yep. Hard bait. And then what's number 4?
Number 4 would be a soft shrimp of some type.
Okay.
So we typically I'll use a Zerek live shrimp. Do you get Zerek lures in the US?
How do you spell it?
Zerek. Zerek live shrimp.
Yeah. I've heard of Zerek.
Yep, they're a great soft plastic lure. Chase bait flick prawn's another one. I like the light version. They have a light and heavy version of those lures. But I find in Australia from pretty much, or anywhere from right down south, right up to the north, prawns are a staple diet for so many species. We call them prawns, you guys call them shrimp, but they're a staple for just about any species, from whiting through brim, through flathead, jewfish, barramundi, you name it. So I think it should just about be mandatory to have a soft plastic shrimp of some sort in your tackle box. And I like to fish these. I like to keep in mind that with a shrimp style lure, you're trying to imitate a shrimp. So how does a shrimp move? Well, there are a couple of different ways. One is it sort of creeps along the bottom slowly if it's in a casual kind of mood and doesn't feel threatened. The other is that it darts along quickly if it feels threatened by fish or by some other predator. So they're the two ways I'll work that. And they're good sunk down and then just crept along the bottom with very short, subtle movements, or sunk to the bottom and then hopped along with quite sharp, erratic movements, depending on your mood and depending on whether the fish appear to be actively chasing the shrimp and the water's busting up with shrimp trying to get away, then you'd probably work it a little bit more aggressively.
And are you guys buying yours pre-rigged or do you rig them yourself?
Look, we do both. We do both. I prefer to rig them myself because it gives me the flexibility to play around with hooks and rig them weedless and weight them differently and that kind of thing. But you can do it either way. Yeah. Yeah,
it's interesting. We've got our own prawn coming up that we've been working with a couple people down in Brazil. Down there they call it the robalo, which is really just the snook. And that's all they use down there. Like they don't use hard, at least from all the people we've talked to, they don't use hard baits. They're literally just using this big old shrimp. And obviously they'll change up the size based on the season. But that's it. It's that in a pretty big jig head in most cases. And so I love what you said, because I agree. But so many of these companies, including Z-Man, who we love, and including Chase Baits, who we love and we have in our shop now, they're all pre-rigged. And I was like, man, it'd be so much cooler if they weren't. And it's tough to find just the bodies sold by themselves, because then like you said, you can mess around with it and do them weedless, and then all of a sudden you're able to get in all kinds of structure. And man, they're so doggone expensive. Like that's my only problem with like Chase Baits. I don't know if they're expensive there like they are here, but I mean, single shrimp could set you back $15 sometimes. Yes. It's like, or even those little crabs for like sheep's head and stuff here. It's like, oh my gosh. It does make you think twice about throwing them into heavy structure, that's for sure. And that's not what you want with a lure, because if you're not putting it amongst structure, you're not putting it in the zone where the fish are likely to be. So I have been known to do surgery on soft plastic shrimps and remove the hooks and then glue them back together with super glue. And you can, the soft plastic can be welded as well using a soldering iron. I've done all kinds of weird and wonderful Frankenstein type lures where I've pulled the hooks out and then tried to re-rig them with my own style of hooks. But that's another story for another time. Well, yeah, the good news is a lot of these shrimp, the material is pretty tough. Do you guys have DOA shrimp?
Yes, we do. Yeah, that's another great one. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Huh.
Yep.
Interesting. And then the Z-Man as well, I assume?
Yes, Z-Man's got a shrimp as well. Most of the major manufacturers have got a shrimp. So MMD is another local brand that has a great shrimp pattern as well. And yeah, Samaki have got one as well. So yeah, most of the major manufacturers have got a shrimp. And I think, they're all slightly different, but they're all fished in the same way and they're all effective in the right circumstances. So I've mentioned a few brands here, but really they're just about interchangeable, I think, as far as the shrimp go.
Yep, cool. But Xeric and chase baits in the kind of the two favorites. All right, my friend, number 5. And then I'm curious, you've interviewed how many? 250? 300?
Yeah, about 250 people. Okay. Yep.
I'm curious, and we'll talk about this after the 5th. I'm hoping you've been taking some notes and maybe seen some trends, right? Of saying, all right, if you like Tim Ferriss, do you ever listen to his podcast?
I do. Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. He wrote that book. I thought it was fascinating. The ones about the Titans, where, he basically just curated all of his hundreds of interviews with all these billionaires and wealthy and successful people and just put it into one book. And I don't know, maybe an idea for you.
Well, it's funny you should say. Let's have a talk about that after this lure.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. That's actually very much on the agenda. So
cool. That's awesome.
Lure number 5, Joe, would be a soft plastic vibration bait of some sort.
Okay.
Now, I love these. Again, I've chosen lures for versatility. So if I'm limited to 5 lures, anywhere I go, I know that these are going to be effective lures. And I guess a good example of one of those is the Jackal Trans Am, which is a very popular lure over here. A couple of our local ones, and one of my very favourites is the Xeric Fish Trap and the Samaki Thumper Tail. The Thumper Tail is a slightly different lure in that it's a soft plastic vibe, but it's got a big flat paddle tail on the back of it as well. So, it's an interesting lure. But I like these because, once again, you can cast them over weed beds, you can keep the rod tip up high, you can rip them straight through, and I'd switch over to a single hook on the front. For that, I'd probably remove the treble hook from the rear and just have the single hook on the front, rip them through the weed beds, burn them straight across, and they'll get those active fish. You'll get the reaction bite doing that. But they can equally be dropped down into the holes around the rock bars, and they can be hopped along the bottom in subtle lifts. And one of the more effective techniques for a range of species in Australia is to lift that lure up, from the rod going from around about probably 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock, lift it up very, very slowly, just enough that you can feel the vibration of the lure, and then wind back down, just keeping in touch with the lure, because quite often for a lot of our species, the strike's going to come as that lure is dropping back down rather than when it's lifting up. And that's a very effective way to fish for a whole range of species in a whole range of different situations. So they're a very, very, very useful lure here.
So for everyone listening, including me, what's the big difference between your number 1, which is just a soft plastic paddle tail, like, our Slam Shady, and a soft plastic vibration bait? Is it size? Is it the way it's rigged, type of hooks?
It's probably more profile and the vibration that it pumps out. I think the paddle tail is a little more subtle vibration, whereas the vibration bait is quite a strong vibration, and it works on the way down as well. So if you do as I've just described for the better brands, and there are some cheap, nasty soft plastic vibes out there as well, and I'm not going to mention the names, but yeah, some of those, they'll work fine if you're working them quickly, and they'll work fine on the uplift of the rod. But instead of vibrating and staying vertical as they drop back down, they'll tend to spiral back down on the drop, and so they're not as effective. And so I think it's worth actually paying the money for the better brands when it comes to the soft plastic vibes. I'm happy to be corrected if somebody knows a cheap lure. I love cheap lures at work, don't get me wrong, but typically I find that the cheaper ones are not as effective. So, but for me, it's more about the profile of the lure. So it's a big flat-sided thing rather than a more lengthy, elongated sort of a pattern compared to the soft plastic paddle tails.
Yep.
And I think that it imitates a different style of bait, and it also creates a much different vibration. Anytime you've got big flat sides, I also really love the hard plastic vibes, I've got to say, and I make wooden vibes as well, which is another story again. I really like that style of lure. So it was a hard call for me to choose the soft plastic, but I think it's the more versatile of the lures. But Anytime you've got that big flat side, if you think about that moving, in order to move, that has to displace a lot of water. And so it creates a very, very intense vibration. And so that style of lure is very, very good where you're fishing in low light conditions or you're fishing in dirty water or turbulent water where you need that little bit of extra vibration and noise for the fish to be able to key in on. And that's where I find it very useful.
Too cool, man. So those are the 5, and you would take them anywhere. So if you're going to England, going to I guess England might be a bad example. Going over to Florida, you're gonna bring these 5 with you.
If I had those 5 in my box, I would be confident that I could catch a fish or 2. Sure.
Love it. Any specific colors was my next question. In general, do you have like a favorite?
Look, I don't. I'm not actually much of a colour guy, and I get into an extreme armchair angler is going to be listening intently at this. He's going to be upset with me because he accuses me all the time of avoiding the subject of colour. But I think that colour can be really important at times, particularly when you're fishing really clear water systems and the sun's up high and that kind of thing. And there's certainly times where it makes a big difference. But for me, the first considerations are always about the size, the depth, and the sound and vibration of the lure, because those are the things that, to a greater extent, I think influence whether a fish is going to find the lure, firstly, and whether it's going to take it, secondly. And I think particularly sound is one thing that people overlook a lot. And I say regularly on the podcast, sound travels 5 times faster through water than it does through air, and fish can hear sound. Unlike human beings, when we stick our head under the water, we can't tell which direction the sound's coming from, right? Because our ears determine which direction sound's coming from by the difference in the time it takes to get from our left ear to our right ear and vice versa. It doesn't work underwater because sound travels so fast that our brain can't distinguish the difference in that timing, whereas fish can. And sound's very important because they can often hear a lure long before they see it. And I say to people, if you've got a fish that's been exposed to a particular lure and a particular sound and vibration multiple times, it becomes very aware of that. If it hears that sound before it sees a lure, it's already alert that there's something not quite right. On the other hand, of course, if that lure sounds like something that creates a curiosity, or it sounds like something that a fish associates with a feed, then it could be switched on and ready to strike before it even sees the lure. So for me, those are the things that I consider first of all. Then when it comes to colour, I used to have a saying, any colour will do as long as it's black. And as a uni student, I used to spend a lot of time with a Sharpie colouring in lures because I couldn't buy black lures. I made my own by colouring them in with a Sharpie. I like contrast. And if you look at the fish's eye anatomically, if you look under a microscope at the retina of a fish's eye, what you'll find is there's 2 types of cells. And this is the same for mammals. It's the same for amphibians, reptiles, human beings, birds, any higher animal. There are 2 types of cells in the retina, 2 types of photosensitive cells. One is the rod cells, and they detect light and dark. And the other is the cone cells, which detect the different wavelengths that contribute to us interpreting something as a colour. Now, with fish, they have around about, depending on species, it varies tremendously, but 40 to 200 rod cells for every cone cell. Human beings have about 20 to 1. And what that tells us is that in the fish's world, contrast is far more important than colour and it makes sense because the cone cells need lots of light in order for them to work. And so rather than focus on colour, I'll focus more on things that create flash, things that create contrast and make the lure more visible. And then the last thing I'll consider is the colour. And typically for me, I tend to like natural colours that mimic bait fish, unless things are shut down. And then I'll try some of those lairier, brighter colours to try and get that reaction strike or annoy a fish or whatever it is that I'm trying to do if they're not taking the lure that I'd expect they'd take. So that's kind of my take on colour. But I think there's just so many other factors to consider first that, it doesn't come into my thinking until later on. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because, we're always trying to get that edge, right? The step up, the advantage over the fish. And we, that's why I read all these different books about it. And you're right. At the end of the day, because we got color, we got scent, you have all these, these variables, but at the end of the day, the fish has to be able to find it and they have to be able to see it and it has to look natural, right? Which is why we spend so much time talking about rigging and retrieval. And even watching like kind of game film, you mentioned the power of the drop and having some type of lure that's going to have some action and vibration on the drop. We did a video where we were out fishing and caught quite a few fish and nice fish. and we were kind of watching some of the game film, if you will, before we took it live, and Luke would slow it down. He's like, watch this. And he has an old school, his older boat, an old school trolling motor that's, not one that you can just, hit a little button, and it's not one of these brand new fancy ones that'll just hold you in the spot with spot lock. Yeah. But so every time, so he'd make the cast, he'd retrieve, and he's using a paddle tail, the Slam Shady. He retrieved, and every time he'd stop to bend over to change either the direction of the speed of the trolling motor. That was every single time. 100% of the strikes came where he literally stopped reeling. He bent down, so it dropped maybe, 7-8 inches, maybe a foot, and every strike was happening there. And it happened like 7 times in a row. We're like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. And so guess what you do next trip? You don't obviously have to hit the trolling motor. You just make a few pauses, and boom, all those strikes were happening. And it's very powerful, regardless if you got one of your you call them the vibe baits. I love that. Or even just a paddle tail, something that has some type of motion and looks natural when it's going down on the drop. So I'm glad you.
I think that works on so many different lures, Joe, and even topwater. Working that Bass Day sugar pen. Sometimes it works depending on the species. If I'm fishing for whiting, it's going to be a constant retrieve all the way back to the rod tip. But for brim and barramundi and other species, quite often I'll put a pause in, and you could pause for 10, 15, 20 seconds. Sometimes the fish will take it on the pause. Other times it'll just hang under that lure, and the instant it starts to move again, bang, it's on. Yeah. But the same thing with suspending hard bodies, for example. I love fishing barramundi with suspending hard bodies because they tend to tail the lure, and they're so close. They're an inch or two behind it, and the instant you pause, the lure stops, but the fish kind of keeps going. And as he keeps going, his instant reaction is to open his mouth. Yeah. And then it's all over the lure. I don't know if they even intend to take the lure, but they've taken it. And so I think you can fool them into taking a lure just by pausing. So it's really, really important.
That's funny. All right. I want to pivot. What are your thoughts down under on saltwater catfish? You guys have saltwater catfish?
Look, we do. Saltwater catfish here in Australia, unfortunately, they're considered an unfortunate bycatch. They're not generally considered a good eating fish, and we generally try and avoid them.
Yeah, we're on the same page, so there's a lot of similarities there. So.
Yeah, they are actually a great fighting fish, and when you hook one, you can think you're onto something really good, and get a little bit disappointed when it comes up both sides. Yes. But if you're out there for the sport, there's nothing wrong with targeting a few catfish. They're a great species. Just be careful of those spikes as you're trying to get them off the hook.
Yeah, especially here in Florida, there's a lot of them. And, they're slimy. They slime up your line. They're just, and obviously can cause some serious damage if you get your hand in the wrong end of the fin. But yeah, we have kind of an ongoing, we even had a shirt that had a big picture of a saltwater catfish and a big round red circle and a kind of the X through it. And it says no cats on board. And that was one of our top selling shirts for a while. So I always have to ask, if people have the salt.
Yeah. They're another good reason to use single hooks with a crush down barb and have a pair of boga grips on board, and just don't bring them on board, but enjoy the fight. They fight hard.
And another great reason to use more top water and kind of more higher subsurface baits, because the majority of the guys catching the real good catfish catchers are they're using cut bait and they're using live bait that's kind of sitting on the bottom, and those catfish are just inhaling it. So
yeah,
too funny. All right, so back to this whole Tim Ferriss type of idea. So is it almost kind of the same three? Obviously, have not listened to all 300 of your podcasts. Is it? Are the guys usually saying the same, or is it? What's the percentage of overlap?
Sorry, I'm not sure. I'm
talking about it in terms of, you always ask your guest the top 3 lures, and they always mention like 7. Like, what are you got to be picking up on some trends of, all right, these are the lures that you keep working over and over and over again. And I'm sure there's probably some of the ones we talked about here today.
Look, I have. And one of the things that I've done, in fact, I've just done it recently and updated it, is that I've put onto my website, which is doclures.com, I've put a lure selection tool. And what it allows you to do is go back, there's a table in there with a whole bunch of filterable drop-down boxes. So you can go in there and you can sort it by species, and you can sort it by location, you can sort it by various other factors, and it'll pull up a list of all the lures that my guests have recommended for that particular species and location over the last 304 episodes that I've published so far. So that's all on the website, and that's available. And I've got an app that's just about to go live as well that'll allow you to look at that on your mobile phone as well. But the other thing I'm doing, Joe, is I'm taking a leaf out of Tim Ferriss's book, and also Stephen Covey. I don't know if you probably know Stephen Covey or know of Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So one of the things that I've found by interviewing 250 of Australia's tournament anglers, long-term guides, fishing journalists, people that fish hard 4, 5, 6 times a week, have been doing it for years and years and years, is there's a whole bunch of different habits and behaviors. And some of these things they're not even aware of. They're things that they've been doing for so long, they've just become a habit. They've become natural. And I've been compiling a list of those, and I'm in the process of putting together an audiobook around the habits of highly successful anglers. And I've got some people in my membership. I've got a similar sort of setup to Saltwater. I've got a membership area that I've just launched. And people like Extreme Armchair Angler are in that membership area, and I'm providing them with drafts of the script as I go along, and I develop the script, and they're providing feedback, and we're bouncing around some ideas that I'm eventually going to turn into an audiobook. And that'll be available through my membership site. It'll also be available on Audible once I get that up and going. So stay tuned for that. It's a bit like the 7 Habits, or Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich is another good example. So it's just taking all those learnings from observing lots of anglers over a long period of time and seeing some of those things that to them are just habit and just normal, but to regular weekend anglers don't necessarily come naturally, and that they might not have even thought of.
Yeah, it's too cool. You mentioned the lure selection tool. Is that right there at doclures.com? Is that public, or is that for your members?
If you go to doclures.com, and on the top menu bar, there's a tools tab. If you click down on ALF Lure Suggested, that'll bring up the table, and you can go through and sort and filter to your heart's desire there, Joe. And when you come over here to have a fish with me, you'll know exactly what lures to bring with you.
Probably going to be just these 5, right?
Well, that'd be a good start. They'd be the ones I'd bring, but lots of other anglers use lots of other lures as well.
Too cool.
Which is what makes it so interesting.
So the one I'm curious, I know you guys have it. I had Mark Sosin on the podcast, and I'd ask him about, I think the question was, if you only have one lure, what would it be? And he said it was a white bucktail jig. And he said the reason, he said, one, it just works. He's like, but 2, he told me the story about, I think it was World War II, where they gave all of these, young men, all these soldiers who were over there fighting, and kind of their emergency first aid, like, you're on your own kit. And every kit was a little bit of mono fishing line and a white bucktail jig.
Yep.
So that was how much the military said, this is something that'll catch fish no matter where you get stuck in this war. And I always thought that was interesting. So is that a big one for you guys?
Look, it's not a huge one in Australia, but having said that, I interviewed a chap by the name of Hugh Gange, who runs a fishing charter business and lodge in northern Australia, up on the Coburg Peninsula. And it's a very remote part of Australia, and he was the first person on the show that actually said a white bucktail jig was one of his preferred lures. And it makes a lot of sense where he is, because it's a very, very remote place, very difficult to get to. And he can have a whole bunch of these things. They don't take up a lot of space. You can have a whole bunch of them in his box. They're not expensive. It's a place where you're going to get bricked a lot in reef by a lot of different species. So he's not scared to throw these things in amongst the reef. And if you lose one or two, not a big deal. You can make them yourself. So back at camp, you can knock them up. And so they're a great lure. And I didn't mention any jigs at all in this list of 5, but that was a hard call to drop them out as well. There's lots of opportunities to use jigs.
No, it's super tough for any fisherman, let alone the doc himself, who loves talking about lures. It probably gave you anxiety when you read my email right before we went live.
Yeah, I went into meltdown. I had to go and have a second coffee.
Good stuff, my friend. Well,
I have to say, Joe, as I said at the start, it was poetic justice, because I've interviewed so many people and forced them to narrow down to their favourites that it was kind of it was fitting that I was forced to do the same thing.
Yeah, and I apologize. I sent it. I in my eyes, like, I give him plenty of time because I sent it not, remembering that we're on opposite times and you were sound asleep when I sent that, and all of a sudden you're doing this in the morning. It's evening for me, so I apologize. But yeah, you nailed it. That was awesome.
It's good. I've enjoyed it.
That was awesome. So where can everyone go find out more about you? Subscribe, get on your email list, download your podcast, subscribe. So
look, there's plenty of places, Joe. So doclures.com, doclures.com is my website. So you'll find all of my podcast episodes on there. You'll find I do some live streams as well. I've been running sonar masterclasses with Navico, Lowrance, and Simrad, where I do some live stream Q&A sessions on those. There's a whole bunch of different resources on doclures.com. But if you just want to listen to the podcast, that's all over the place on Spotify and Stitcher and Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts. You'll find that if you just Google Doc Lures or Australian Lure Fishing Podcast, either one will bring that up. And hit the subscribe button, of course, and make sure you get every episode because we have some pretty cool conversations.
Yes, subscribe, leave him a review, and definitely stay tuned for yours truly, Joe Simons, might be on the show at some point in the future. We need to get down there once this whole COVID thing gets better. I told you I spent some time, about 4 months in Australia and a little bit in New Zealand as well when I was younger and single and could travel like that. And what an amazing place and just great people. And I had an absolute blast.
Well, I have to say, Joe, I've been to the States on 4 occasions now. I haven't made it to Florida yet. So I think you and I need to have a bit of a chat. But from where I'm sitting right now, I'm about 40 kilometers from where you can catch grander black marlin. About 5 minutes away, you can catch 40-inch barramundi. We're about 100 kilometers away from the world's oldest rainforest, untouched rainforest. The fishing possibilities here are enormous, and there's a spare room here, mate. Anytime you come over to Australia, you're more than welcome to come and stay. Awesome. And bring those 5 lures, and I'll show you how I use them.
Awesome, brother. Well, thank you again. Everyone go check out Doc Lures, get on the podcast, and stay tuned for more. I know we're going to chat offline about some other ideas. Maybe we can all collaborate since we all love talking about lures, and I think it's a great way to learn about what works, right? I mean, there's a lot of the ways that lures get kind of indoctrinated and introduced in new areas is because someone brings them, like this shrimp from Brazil, right? All of a sudden now we're having people in Florida saying, well, man, this thing works like crazy. And so I think it's cool to have, different cultures and seeing what's working there. So I appreciate you, brother.
I agree. No, it's been tremendous, Joe. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I've thoroughly enjoyed the chat, and I look forward to some collaboration. It'd be great.
Yep. Cool. And everyone listening, if you disagree, well, too bad. Those are the lures that work for Greg. And in all seriousness, we'd love feedback like always. So the best place, if you want to make sure that the two of us get it, is to go to saltstrong.com/podcast, and you'll see this up there at the top is the most recent. And if you're obviously listening to this a year later, then you're just going to have to search for it. And leave us a comment in the comment section. It'll come to me directly, and I usually forward them on to the guest if it's a question for them. So, guys, we appreciate you. Love you, and we'll talk to you on the next episode. Peace. We're out. Thank you, brother.
Thank you, Joe.
'Cause fishing, it's in my soul. It was passed down to me from the days of old. Find us on the water if there was a way. It's been said my papa, he wrote the book on catching big reds and 20-pound snook. I wish I knew all the things he knew today. For he's the reason why we are this way. And he put fishing